Modification is relatively simple. Even though modification most often involves one word, an adjective or an adverb, it could certainly indicate or include a modifying phrase or even clause. So whether it's a single word or a combination structure of words, still modifiers all operate the same way. And that is that for a modifier to be correct, it has to be absolutely near whatever it is that it's modifying, and it has to be absolutely clear, and there can be no ambiguity. Otherwise, you have one or another fault with modification, faulty modification. Two of the most common types of faulty modification involve dangling and misplaced modifiers. Now, the misplaced are probably the most easy to understand because it's very, very simple. The word indicates perfectly that they are just in the wrong place. And sometimes this is more characteristic of conversation than it is writing, but nevertheless it does occur in writing. And when you're modifying something, I mean, obviously if I said, well, the house big is going to, you say, whoa, something's wrong there. That's right. It's because in our language, normally the modifier comes before the word, so I would say, well, the big house rather than house big. But of course, in Spanish, it's quite different. So what we're talking about then, for consistency in modification, whether it's a single word or a phrase, it has to be in the correct place. Sometimes we can write or say, and we might be totally unconscious of it, sometimes we can put a modifier, especially one word, between two things, either of which it could modify. And sometimes it's not until the editorial place that we realize, in the editorial process, that we realize that we've done this. But again, it is not correct to have a modifier, in spite of what you want or in spite of what you know that you're doing in terms of your writing or speaking, still, for the sake of somebody reading the document or listening, a modifier cannot be between two things, either of which it could modify, especially in writing. In speaking, you might be able to use emphasis to carry your point, but in writing, that emphasis is not there, and a reader could not possibly know. Another thing that's very, very common with misplaced modifiers is that there are a few words, and the most common is only, and the second most common is almost, and we just about place those words early, maybe 90% of the time, maybe a little bit more than 90% of the time, but in particular, only. Beware, in terms of writing and speaking, that it is normal for us all to place only, and sometimes almost, prematurely in a sentence. Generally one word, but still, careful attention to the placement, you can avoid these things. You do need to see some of them on paper. You need to look at some examples in which they're very, very commonly used incorrectly to realize indeed, the correct placing of these modifiers. But still, the misplaced modifier is not particularly difficult. Now, dangling modifiers represent a little bit different story. What they're actually trying to do, a dangling modifier is said to be dangling when it's attempting to modify something that's not in the sentence. Now, ordinarily, there might be a form of what the dangling modifier is attempting to modify, but even a proper adjective, let's say if you take the adjective Ernest Hemingway's, which as a possessive word, that is not a noun, but a possessive word, and it can't be modified by an adjective because itself is a possessive adjective. So sometimes we try to modify proper possessive adjectives with other adjectives, and that can't be done, and a modifier in that position is said to be dangling. It's attempting to modify, let's say, Ernest Hemingway. Ernest Hemingway is not in the sentence. Ernest Hemingway's is, as in Ernest Hemingway's novel The Sun Also Rises, but still, it's hard to visualize that this is not correct because you absolutely know that his refers to Ernest Hemingway's, but again, adjectives cannot modify proper adjectives themselves. They have to modify only nouns and pronouns. So with both the dangling and the misplaced modifier, very, very careful reading, very careful revision of the material is essential, as well as a fundamental knowledge of how these things occur and how to correct them. Thank you.